20 years at the top of Chicago, and not one person who came for him ever walked away the same way they arrived. But the most dangerous thing about this man was never his power. It was the single rule he followed while everyone around him was falling apart. My name is Marcus, and this is the story history never told you about the man who ran Chicago's underworld longer than anyone thought possible. If stories like this are what you live for, subscribe right now, because we drop one every single week, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. His name was Theodore Raymond Watkins. Nobody called him that. On the south side of Chicago, from the corner of 47th Street all the way to the edges of the Bronzeville district, everyone called him one thing: the architect. Not because he built buildings, because he built systems, invisible structures of loyalty, money, and silence that held an entire underground world together for 2 full decades. He never wore a uniform, he never carried a title. But every numbers runner, every car dealer, every backroom operator between Cook County and the Indiana state line knew exactly who kept the lights on. Theodore was born in 1921 in a 2-room apartment above a laundry on South State Street. His mother worked 6 days a week pressing other people's clothes. His father disappeared before Theodore's 3rd birthday. By the time he was 9 years old, he was running errands for the men who ran the neighborhood. By 14, he understood something most men twice his age never figured out: that the real power in any room was never the loudest, it was the quietest one, the one that never needed to repeat itself. Chicago in the 1940s was a city of layers. On the surface, it was jazz clubs and stockyards, a city rebuilding itself after the Great Depression. But underneath that surface ran a whole other economy: the policy game. What most people outside Chicago called the numbers racket was the financial engine of the South Side. Poor families bet nickels and dimes on 3-digit combinations. If your number hit, you walked away with enough to cover rent, groceries, maybe even something extra. The men who ran those policy wheels controlled more than money. They controlled hope, and Theodore Watkins understood that better than anyone. He entered that world at 17, working as a runner for a man named Clarence Big C Holloway, the most established policy operator on the South Side. Theodore was fast, reliable, and most importantly, discreet. He never talked too much. He never asked questions he wasn't supposed to ask. And he had a memory like a vault. Numbers, names, routes, faces, everything filed away perfectly. Big C noticed within 6 months. By the time Theodore was 22, he was no longer running errands. He was running operations. What separated Theodore from every other operator in Chicago was the rule. There was one thing he refused to do. One line he drew in the ground from the very beginning and never once crossed in 20 years. He would not touch narcotics, not distribution, not financing, not even indirect involvement. While every other major operator in Chicago was being approached by suppliers coming in from the East Coast and from overseas network, Theodore turned every single one of them down. His answer was always the same, delivered calmly, without apology. That is not what we do here. People thought he was being cautious at first. Then they thought he was being naive. Then, one by one, they started disappearing. Federal investigators had been building cases across the Midwest throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s. The men who had laughed at Theodore's rule were the first ones to go. Grand jury indictments, federal sentences, operations dismantled overnight. Theodore watched it happen from a distance and never said a word about it. He did not need to. The results spoke loud enough on their own. By 1955, Theodore Watkins controlled the most sophisticated policy operation Chicago had ever seen. He had 20 three-wheel locations spread across the South Side and into parts of the West Side. He employed over 300 people directly: runners, bookkeepers, lookouts, collectors. He had relationships with city aldermen, precinct captains, and 2 sitting judges who understood that a stable South Side was better for everyone than a chaotic one. His operation ran with the precision of a legitimate business, because in every way that mattered to the people it served, it was one. Theodore paid fair. He settled disputes quickly. He did not allow his people to be mistreated by anyone, inside the organization or outside of it. When a runner got into trouble with the wrong people, Theodore handled it personally, not with threats or confrontation, with conversation, with resources, with the kind of quiet authority that made problems disappear before they became crises. The community around him understood what he represented. He was not just a businessman. He was infrastructure. The challenge came in 1957 when a new organization began moving into Chicago from the East Coast. They were well-funded, well-connected, and completely uninterested in existing arrangements. They approached every major operator on the South Side with the same offer: join the new structure or be absorbed by it. Most operators either folded immediately or began quiet negotiations. Theodore did neither. He called a meeting at a restaurant on East 51st Street and invited every independent operator who had not yet made a decision. 17 men showed up. Theodore sat at the head of the table and spoke for less than 10 minutes. He laid out exactly what the new organization's arrival would mean for each of them individually, for their families, for the neighborhoods that depended on what they had built. Then he made a proposal. Not a merger, not a submission. A collective agreement to maintain independence through unity. If they stayed together, held their territory, and refused to be divided, the cost of taking them would be too high for anyone to justify. 12 of the 17 men agreed that night. The other 5 made their own choices and lived with the consequences. The coalition Theodore built held for 4 years, longer than anyone thought possible, and when it finally shifted, it shifted on Theodore's terms, not anyone else's. What the history books rarely capture about men like Theodore Watkins is the texture of daily life inside what they built. It was not glamorous in the way movies suggest. It was work. Constant, careful, unglamorous work. Theodore was in his office, a back room above a dry goods store on South Michigan Avenue, by 7 in the morning every single day. He reviewed his books personally. He took meetings with people who had problems, people who had ideas, people who needed something and had nowhere else to go. He kept a ledger of every favor he extended and every obligation he carried. He believed, with the discipline of a man who had seen what chaos produced, that the only way to sustain anything was to treat it with the seriousness it deserved. He ate lunch at the same diner every day. He was home for dinner 3 nights a week. He read every evening before he slept. People who met him for the first time were often surprised by how ordinary he seemed. That was exactly the point. Theodore Raymond Watkins stepped away from his operation in 1962. He did not go to prison. He did not fall to a rival. He did not lose everything in a single catastrophic moment, the way so many men in his position eventually did. He simply decided that 20 years was enough, that the world was changing in ways that made the old structures impossible to sustain cleanly, and that he would rather leave standing than wait until he had no choice. He moved to a house in a quiet neighborhood on the far South Side. He spent the next decade mentoring young men from the community, helping them find legitimate work, writing letters of recommendation for people who needed a second chance. He died in 1978 at the age of 57, surrounded by family. There was no obituary in the Chicago Tribune. There was no monument. But on the South Side, in the barbershops and the church basements and the kitchen tables of people who remembered what the neighborhood looked like when he was in it, his name was spoken with something that does not get handed out easily in places like that. It was spoken with gratitude. If this story reminded you that real power is built on principles and not just position, then this channel is exactly where you need to be. We tell the stories that history filed away and forgot, the men and women who shaped entire worlds without ever making the front page. Subscribe right now and turn on your notifications, because every single week we go deeper into the lives of the people who actually ran things. drop a comment below and tell us, do you think Theodore made the right call walking away when he did, or should he have stayed? And share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that the most dangerous thing a person can carry is not a weapon. It is a standard they refuse to compromise. We will see you in the next one.